Hello and welcome to this event focusing on orphan medicines and asking how can innovation be sustained in this area of high unmet need. My name is Sue Saville and I'm delighted to be guiding you through the discussions this morning. It's of course 20 years since the EU orphan regulation was adopted, and that was to stimulate the creation of new medicines to treat rare diseases for the 1 in 17 Europeans, that's some 30 million people who suffer with these conditions. And in that time, the number of medicines for these conditions has gone up from just 8 to over 160. But of course, much more needs to be done to reach that unmet need. We want to find out how that can be achieved. It's wonderful to have so many of you joining us this morning. I see from all over Europe and indeed from beyond. We've got a fantastic panel with us this morning. They come from patient representatives, from industry, from the European Commission, and indeed from EFPIA, that's the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. They're hosting this event. But over to the panel themselves, let them introduce themselves. Who are you all, please? Let's start then with Tide. Who are you and who do you represent?
Good morning, Sue. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tede Goldhorn. I'm part of the orphan and pediatric team at DG Santé, European Commission, working on the evaluation of the two regulations and also on the follow-up. Thank you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And representing our patients, who do we have?
You have Simone Boselli, Public Affairs Director at EURORDIS Rare Diseases Europe, the largest patient organization working for finding treatments and cures for people with rare diseases in Europe.
Thank you. And representing the industry and EFPIA, the organization, who's there?
Good morning, Ulf Staginus. I'm the Global Head of Market Access with Ipsen Pharma based in Switzerland. Look forward to a fruitful discussion today.
That's great. Well, we have a lovely panel and we're going to have great discussions, and we do want to hear from you, the audience, and you can put your questions using the Q&A function on the screen. Do try to keep those questions fairly tight so that we can read them out and get through as many as we can. We'll weave them through the discussions, and as they come in and they're relevant, we've got an hour and 15 minutes for this, so let's hope we can touch on a lot of your questions too. This event is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it back later on YouTube, show it to your family, friends, that sort of thing. And please do use the hashtag, that is hashtag questions inspire solutions, to get this out there much further. So before we get into the panel discussions, we want to set the scene a bit. As a journalist, I love exclusives and I love firsts, and we can announce here the launch of a report this morning, and that is by the consultancy Dolan. It's on the estimated impact of EU orphan regulation on incentives for innovation. And with us to explain the findings of that is the Managing Director of Dolan, Adam Hutchings. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Sue. Good morning, everybody. My name's Adam Hutchings. I'm the Managing Director of Dolan. We're a rare disease consultancy. I'm also a health economist, and I've spent the last 20 years working in biopharmaceuticals, both on the research side and the commercial side of the industry. So as Sue has said, we're going to be sharing with you some of the results of an analysis we just published. Before I go into the methods and the results, first thing to say is that this work was sponsored by EFPIA. However, the analysis is all our own, and EFPIA and its members do not necessarily endorse either the input parameters in our model, nor indeed necessarily the results. We take full responsibility for our own work. The ambition for this work was to evaluate how EU legislation has impacted innovation in rare diseases. And in order to answer that question, you really have to know how policy impacts investment decisions in the biopharmaceutical innovation model. So if you'll excuse me, for 2 minutes, I just want to start by giving an overview of what that biopharma innovation model looks like and the way that policy impacts innovation before I go on to the results of our analysis. So first thing to say is that policymakers create what I would call an incentives framework for the industry through the legislation they make. So they determine the length of patents, they determine the process of marketing authorization and approval, pricing and reimbursement systems are all managed by policymakers. And then there are many other rules and regulations that the pharmaceutical industry has to adhere to around marketing, around R&D, around every aspect of the industry. It's perhaps the most regulated industry on earth. And collectively, this forms a framework within which the industry has to make decisions. And in particular, they have to make decisions about which medicines they're going to invest in. And these are tremendously complex decisions. There's three characteristics of the biopharma innovation model that make them difficult. The first is you have to invest a lot of money very early on in the development process to bring a medicine to market. You then have a very long time lag between making that large investment and any potential return on that investment. And then the third aspect is it's associated with very high risk. There's a very good chance you're not going to get any return on that investment because the drug is not going to be successful. And so the question is, how do companies make decisions about what innovations to invest in within this complex environment and in response to these incentive frameworks created by policymakers on behalf of society? And the basic answer to how medicines get developed and which ones get developed, it depends on two factors. Is the potential innovation clinically viable, and is it economically viable? And the clinical viability is about understanding for this very early stage molecule, is there unmet need in that disease area? Do we think this constitutes some form of scientific innovation? Do we think that that might translate to a clinical benefit to patients, an important benefit? And do we think we can develop it so that it can be safe? And that assessment of clinical viability is done by the brilliant doctors and scientists and pharmacists who exist within pharma companies, within the regulators, within the academic community. The second part, which is equally as important in determining whether innovation happens, is it economically viable? Because biopharmaceutical companies have investors, they want a return on their investment, they need to ensure that they're investing in technologies that can provide a return. And the way that economic viability is considered is by assessing, how many patients will receive this product if it's approved, at what potential price point, what's the risk of failure, of never getting to market, how much is it going to cost us to develop this asset, and how long is it likely to take until we get to the market, and how long will we have on our patent left at the point of being approved. And the way that that economic viability is assessed is through economic analyses, and in particular, net present value modeling. And this visual represents that approach. And basically what we have here is a timeline. So the far left-hand side of this graph is the point at which a company makes a decision to invest in an early stage preclinical asset. And then as we go to the right across the graph, we're going through the years to the point of launch, to the point of achieving revenue, and then to the point of loss of patent. And we have sort of three considerations that a company has to assess when making this assessment of economic viability. The first is to look at the green bit, and that's the revenue, that's a positive bit. How do you estimate the potential revenue from a new medicine very early on? Well, you try and estimate how many patients might receive your medicine. So not just how many patients are out there, but how many might get the medicine. You have to estimate what the average price is that you're likely to be reimbursed at. And then you have to estimate how long your patent is likely to be. You then need to estimate how long it's going to take you to get to that point, the time to launch. And then you need to estimate the red bit, and that's the costs. And that broadly falls into two parts. The first part is pre-launch, that's all the R&D expenditure. And then the second part is post-launch, which is all the costs associated with manufacturing, distributing a product, bringing it to patients, complying with regulations, continuing to do safety, clinical studies, all the costs associated with bringing it to patients. And Then when you've assessed those things, if you subtract the red from the green and it's positive, then it's economically viable, right? Well, nearly, but there's one important thing that you have to do, which is you have to adjust for the risk of failure and you have to adjust for the cost of capital. And the reason you have to adjust for risk is clearly because there's a very high probability that your product is not going to make it to market. Only about 1 in 10 products go from early stage clinical studies to approval. And when you reduce the expected future revenue by that risk, your expected return becomes much, much lower. The other thing you have to adjust for is the cost of capital. And the reason you have to do that is because your investors who are funding the development, they have other things they could invest in if they didn't give the money to pharmaceutical companies. They could invest it in Zoom, for example, and make a return immediately. So we have to take that into account, which means we discount all future cash flows, both positive and negative. The combined effect of adjusting for risk and discounting is that future revenues are reduced massively. Future costs are also reduced because if you don't successfully bring a product to market, you don't have those costs. But what isn't reduced so much is the R&D expense, because you have to outlay that money before you find out whether or not you're going to be successful or not. And equally, the discounting has a smaller impact on the R&D costs than on the future costs. So the final outlook on this is that the risk-adjusted net present value analyses becomes much more marginal. And that's the reality of drug development. When you're in very early stage, deciding what to invest in, it's often very economically viable in different diseases and different types of medicines. A couple of things to say about this before I talk about our analysis using this framework. The first thing to say is that it's clear that all the factors that determine the economic viability are heavily impacted by policymakers. So any change to the patent duration, any change to the price potential, that's dramatically going to impact your potential revenue. Equally, any changes that are made around, say, regulators' requirements for the size of trials or the duration of trials, that's going to increase your development costs. And almost every aspect of this is impacted by regulators and policymakers, which makes it a very good tool for understanding how changes to policy will translate to decisions about innovation. And that's why we chose this approach. The other thing, just to say before we move on, is that it's probably also quite clear that within this framework, orphan drugs historically did not look very economically viable. And the reason for that is that estimating the green part, patient numbers is a critical component. And if you're reducing those patient numbers by a factor of potentially 100, clearly the economics is going to get much, much worse, especially because the development costs and the risks don't change proportionately. And that's why orphan drugs historically have not been developed. And that's why there's been a need for these incentives that we've seen in European legislation and beyond. So I'll now move on to our analysis, which, as I said, used this risk-adjusted net present value framework to try and understand how European incentives have impacted innovation in orphan medicines. And we basically constructed a risk-adjusted net present value model. We did it for an average orphan medicine that reflects the cohorts of orphan medicines that have been approved in Europe over the last 20 years. So we tried to create a sort of a base case average orphan drug reflecting those characteristics of those that have been approved. We didn't do this on an individual product level, so we haven't had any access to any confidential information on the economics of orphan drugs that have been developed. All our data has come from the public domain. In our report, there's a lot of description about what those parameters are, where we got them from and why. I'm not going to go into that in much detail here. What I do want to emphasize is that for many of these parameters, the literature has quite a range of potential estimates. And we, by and large, were quite conservative in that we selected things that probably suggest that the economic viability of orphans is more positive than it might otherwise be. And an example of that is around, for example, development expenses, R&D costs. We selected a figure which is at the lower end of those in the published literature. FPO and its members would not agree, I don't think, with our choice, and there are numbers that are significantly higher than this. What this means is that our assessment of economic viability probably is more positive than the reality might be if some of these figures are towards the other end of the spectrum. So there's two main analyses that we did, and I'm going to share with you the outputs of them now. The base case analysis was asking, what does the economic viability of orphan medicines in Europe look like under the status quo, i.e. with the existing European orphan legislation and the incentives that are inherent in that regulation. And to do that, we entered the parameter values that reflected the current status quo, and then we estimated of the medicines that had been developed between 2000 and 2017 and approved in Europe, what proportion of those we would have expected to be economically viable, which is defined as having an RNPV greater than 0. And we suggested, our analysis suggested that 135 of the 142 products that were actually developed would have been economically viable under that environment. So we felt that that meant that our model was reasonably calibrated to the reality. The mean risk-adjusted net present value for this average case was about 38 million euros. How do you interpret that number? Well, a purist economist would say anything above 0 is economically viable, but in reality, investors are looking for significantly higher figures above zero because they are choosing between investment options, both across diseases and medicines, but also across industries. And the literature suggests that they're looking for RNPVs of between 100 and 200 million, which suggests that this 38 million is probably relatively marginal in terms of our base case assessment of the existing economic viability of orphan medicines in Europe. And combined with that, to my former point, we feel that the parameters we've used have, if anything, emphasized the economic viability. It could be less than this. So this is our first analyses. The second analysis was what happens if you didn't have orphan legislation. So if orphan legislation hadn't been introduced, what would the economic viability of orphan medicines in Europe have looked like? And here we see that situation deteriorates significantly. We estimated this by changing parameter values in the model to strip out the beneficial elements of European legislation. So marketing exclusivity, scientific advice, reduced fees. We also accounted for any indirect impact through member state incentives that are directly linked to the legislation. So we accounted for those in our parameters, and when we changed that, we saw the average risk-adjusted MPV falling from 38 million to a negative number, suggesting that the average orphan drug would not be economically viable in the absence of the legislation. And within our model, it suggested that only 61 orphan products would have been developed and launched in Europe had the legislation not been in place, a reduction of about 50% from what was seen in practice. Based on the estimates of the number of patients who have benefited from orphan products in the Technopolis report, we inferred that that would mean about 2 million patients not getting access to a rare disease treatment who have benefited over the last 20 years. So our conclusions from this analysis, and this is a very high-level summary, are that the existing status quo for orphan medicines in Europe represents a marginal economic case, even with legislation, and that in the absence of legislation, we would have seen a significant reduction in innovation in rare diseases, and therefore any further change or any deterioration in the incentives frameworks for rare diseases risks reducing the amount of innovation that we can expect in future. I'll stop there, Sue. I'm happy to take any questions or embellish on any points that you wish.
Thank you very much for that, Adam. It was very, very interesting. And you mentioned there the Technopolis report that came out in the summer and was underpinning then the staff working document from the EC. So Technopolis, though, came up with a different methodology and different figures. I mean, I understand that they say that only 21 of the new medicines were actually due to orphan regulation treatment, but your analysis in your executive summary is saying it's more like 74. So why that difference?
Well, maybe the first thing to say is that it's not uncommon for different economists to come up with different estimates using different models. Their approach was quite different from ours. Ultimately, they took a sort of statistical approach and they looked at the number of orphan medicinal products that have been approved in Europe over the last 20 years. And then they compared that with an alternative case without the legislation. But they estimated that alternative case on the presumption that orphan drugs would have been developed at a rate that was comparable with non-orphan products. And to me, that seems, I think that's an assumption we would need to interrogate, because the whole point of orphan legislation was that orphan medicines were not being developed at the same rate as non-orphan products prior to the legislation. We had very few. So statistical analyses can generate quite different results based on changes in the assumptions. We actually did an alternative statistical analysis just looking at the proportion of products approved pre and post European legislation. Again, a simple statistical analysis. And that suggested that if you look at it that way, you've seen an increase in innovation of between 50 and 90%. So it is valuable having different approaches and different analyses. I would say the strength of our approach is that there's a degree of causality within it. There's a very clear relationship between changes in policy and the decisions that companies make in real life about how they develop medicines. And therefore, we can be reasonably confident that our approach reflects the logic and causality between policy and effect.
Thank you very much for that, Adam. Excuse me. We've got questions coming in, which is great, but I'd like to, just before we go to the questions, hear what our panel make of your findings, Adam. Let's go first to Tidde from the EC DG Sante. What do you make of this, given the sort of assessments that the health departments are having to make across the European Commission now?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sue, and also thank you very much to Adam for this presentation. I mean, clearly there is a wealth of data there. Please allow me to start with the Technopolis study, which was one of the pillars for our evaluation. I mean, indeed, they come up with different estimates. I think it's indeed this 80 to 24, but it's important that it also clearly flagged the positive impact of the regulation on faster introduction of orphan medicinal products and also the wider availability of these products throughout Europe. So there was this positive trend that they flagged, and it also relates to the introduction and the availability. I mean, yeah, clearly the Dolan approach is, I think, very much an economic approach, this causal relationship between incentives and the development. I mean, I think what Technopolis also flagged in their methodology is that, and this has been a big discussion, political discussion for some years now, is also that you need transparency of R&D costs, as we saw that Dolan used, as you said, Adam. You used also some estimates there. I think they're higher than what Technopolis used, but I mean, We also, for example, asked the companies in our surveys about development costs and further info, and I think there were only 2 companies responding to this. So I think this is an element that is very, very important in this discussion around the economic approach. I mean, politically, but also to come up with the right estimates. This was very difficult for Technopolis, and I understand that also Dolan used estimates there. I think just to come back to Technopolis, I think there was also an overall, I mean, there was this trend in development, but there was also this overall correction of the impact. I mean, taking the proportion of development of non-orphans over time as a baseline. I mean, and there the time to market a number of EA markets. So, but indeed, their estimate was lower than what Dolan found. Lastly, I think it's important to flag here that, I mean, we're now discussing a very important element, economic approach, how to incentivize R&D. I mean, clearly this is very important. I mean, I think we also flagged in our evaluation that came out last summer. I mean, on the one hand, the orphan regulation has clearly incentivized R&D. I mean, you can see this at the number of orphan designations over the last 20 years. I mean, 2017, almost 2,000 designations. In that same time period, over 140 orphan medicinal products. So in that sense, the orphan regulation has been successful. But I mean, we also took a wider approach. I mean, it's not only about, I mean, this discussion about incentives and OMP development, but of course, and you already, Sue, you already mentioned this. I mean, there is also this discussion about availability and access to the products throughout Europe. So, I mean, this is also something that we further researched in our evaluation. So, and lastly, I mean, also, I mean, 2000 was a different time and a different year than 2020, and in view also of scientific developments. Yeah, we also took a look at to what extent they can be taken up by the regulation or not. Scientific developments like new trial designs, personalized medicine, ATMPs. So we took a wider approach. I mean, we came up with an evaluation staff working document, taking into account not only how to incentivize R&D, but also very important topics as availability and access. How to address this unmet medical need of 95%. I mean, we will for sure come back to this, but also how, whether the regulation is still fit for purpose to, in view of all kinds of scientific developments. So, but thanks again also to Dolan for this a nice presentation, and yeah, very much looking forward to the further discussion. Thank you.
Tide, thank you very much for your thoughts on that. And I'm interested to hear from the patient's perspective. Simona, what do you make of those findings?
Oh, thank you, Sue, and thank you to Adam for pulling together this very interesting analysis. I think it does provide, taken together with the staff working document from the European Commission, a much needed better understanding and different perspective, or better I say, complementary perspective to the situation, which it is not an easy one. Sometimes the debate around orphans tends to be very black and white in terms of some of the key issues around availability, accessibility, affordability, but it's not. It clearly indicates, and in both sides also the evaluation of the European Commission, that developing a medicine for a rare disease is not easy. But effectively, what the Orphan Medicinal Product Regulation and both reports underline that is that has given new therapeutic and more therapeutic options to an otherwise very underserved large piece of the European population. And that needs to be recognized because we have, through public policy incentives, served a great deal of patients. And the jobs, though, is not done, in the sense that we have seen dramatic improvements in the availability, the new therapies that have come to the market up to 2017. One point that I wanted to highlight, and Tide mentioned it, we are now in 2020. if you look at the 142 therapies that have been approved up to 2017, we now have 187, which is in 3 years quite a staggering number, and is not. And 2020 is not over yet, and perhaps we need some good news in 2020. And the fact is that right yesterday, probably the first ever patient-driven therapeutic option for a very rare disorder, AKU or black bone diseases, was approved by the European Commission, and that was driven by patient and allowed for by the European regulation. So that's what exactly is. We need to understand what these 20 years of 20 years have brought to patient. Clearly, there are great benefits that the regulation has brought forward. I believe the patients served by the regulation has been estimated by the Technopolis report at around 6 million people. Clearly, the job is not done because through our own research and a survey on experience with treatment, we understand that only 5% of our patients are using centrally approved treatment that can be considered as transformative and with a little bit more delicacy considered curative, given the uncertainties that there still are on one-off treatments. But the great majority of treatments are symptomatic treatment. That means that for that population, we still need to have, there are still great unmet needs that needs to be addressed. But we also need to move and find new and better treatment for this population. Inversely, Tidde was mentioning that 95% of diseases that are not yet addressed, and that's also a great problem that we need to face. But also, scientific developments, particularly in the last 5 years, have shown the potential to find new transformative treatment, particularly when we look at gene therapies and cell therapies that are targeting very to ultra rare diseases. So I'm very hopeful. I think the evaluation and the report done by Adam is a good complement of what that is much needed in this debate. But particularly, we need to bear in mind why we're doing this. We're doing this to serve an underserved patient population. Thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you, Simone. Some very, very interesting and helpful points in that. What about from the industry perspective? What do those findings mean for biopharmaceutical companies? Ulf?
Thanks, Sue. First of all, I would like to thank Adam. I think he did a fantastic job in explaining the nature of the pharmaceutical business. I'm in this for 25 years, have launched myself various orphan drugs, in the oncology space, but also in the classic rare disease field. And I think, from the Dolan report and discussion we had, I think there's broad alignment that the OMP regulation has undoubtedly been a great success. It had a very significant impact of rare diseases, stimulating development of new treatments in many areas with untreatable rare diseases. It has also been a great driver for innovations, and in that sense, a wonderful example of the added value of the work of the EU and the Commission. From a standpoint of a company, of course, and operating in this field, and as you know, Ipsen is a mid-sized pharmaceutical company. It is important, as in any other industry, that you have a stable legislative environment that has the right incentives for innovation. It needs to provide access to medicines, obviously, to support these investments. And we've seen in the Dolan report, there's a high uncertainty, and many people are often not aware about how complicated and things are in rare diseases. If I personally think at my experience with Duchenne, for instance, this used to be the graveyard of pharmaceutical development. There has been some progress in the latest years, but if you look at over the long run, lots of failure in the development. So a high risk business and research model that, of course, in order to get into this area, needs a really stable legislative framework that people can, the analysis that Adam obviously has shown. We also should not forget, in the context of our international competitive landscape, I think we want to really maintain sort of the biotech cluster, the European ecosystem that is around rare diseases, that they don't get, compromised, because the development of the orphan medicines drug regulation has, of course, created a large system of diverse stakeholders. Not only the small, mid-sized, and innovative companies, the bigger companies, but also academics, hospitals, family, the many patient organizations that exist, healthcare physician involvement, etc. There's a lot of passion and commitment and dedication in that area, and we see this at Ipsen as well in our area of FOP, how broad the ecosystem is around that. As an industry, of course, we do challenge also the issues that we still have, where we need to find solutions. Access, is someone who just mentioned. Beyond the regulation, obviously, another important factor in the entire area. And as I'm here also on behalf of FPR, in that sense, we support the creation of a high-level forum in order to really understand and create novel, flexible, and collaborative models to solve the access issues that still exist beyond the discussion of incentives to R&D and regulation. Thank you.
Very much for that perspective. It's very interesting to hear your responses. It's great to be getting questions coming in. Don't forget to tweet. Questions inspire solutions. You mentioned there, Ulf, about patient organizations in the wider ecosystem. A question's come in from Barbara McLaughlin to all the panelists. She said, would you agree that increasingly patients and patient organizations are involved in defining whether a medicine will be clinically viable, and when they're not, whether they should be? Is that something, Simona, you'd like to pick up?
You guessed right. That's been one of the drivers of Eurordis for the past 20 odd years, getting patient involved at every single stage of development of medicine. And we are seeing that, well, the work that we are doing is not only helping out identifying what the real unmet needs are for the patient, but also making better drugs. The example I quoted before on black-bone diseases is exactly an example of grit and research of parents in a situation that is always very extreme, and the result of great collaboration between patient, research, academics, and the industry, through also the work that we do with the regulators. But a couple of examples of how patient and patient association can be involved are what we push for community advisory boards, which basically look at diseases and bring together disease and patient association and industry to drive research in specific areas, but also the recently completed Paradigm project, which supports the industry to decide how patient engagement should look like throughout the clinical development and the life cycle of a therapy.
Thank you. We'll take another question that's come in now, relevant here. Sarah Mofids asks, do you think that the development of the use of real-world data and real-world evidence as promoted by the regulators will increase the economic viability of orphans, as the price of studies is largely decreasing in that case? Ulf, is that one for you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, the comment I made about access is very much related to that. I think, over time, we have the issue that we always do these sort of ex ante assessments of a product at the time of launch, and the complexity of certain rare diseases and the data that you can collect simply by the number of patients and the challenges you have sometimes in slow progressing diseases. Is the FOP, where Ipsen is currently invested in, for instance, is one of the examples, where you need time to show certain difference and benefits on the patient perspective. So, of course, the real-world evidence will be a very important part, and we encourage this in any way. And potentially in the future, it will, of course, also allow to develop novel access and reimbursement models for those diseases where the evidence may not be as clear as it we would all like and assess at the time of approval.
Okay, thank you. And another very good question coming in. I'd like to place this one with Tide. Beatrice Monadero asks, I'd like to ask about the EC review on orphan medicines regulation published recently that mentioned that there have been some unintended effects of the legislation. She asks, is orphan medicine regulation going to be changed in the short future? And if so, in which direction? Tide, what's the view?
No, thank you, Sue. Thank you also for this question. I mean, I think what I also in my introduction, I think the evaluation shows that there is very positive aspects of the orphan regulation, as also flagged today. But there is also some challenges, some very important challenges. For example, around this unmet medical need, around availability and access, these scientific developments that were not there in 2000, but they're now there, and how should we be dealing with these scientific developments? So just to and in that sense, we are currently, I mean, so we're working on an inception impact assessment, so a document that should be published by the end of next month, which should also provide further information about some of the problems that are currently there and how they should be addressed. And the first step will be a publication of a roadmap, and then also a feedback mechanism to gather relevant input from all stakeholders. So that is the next step. I think that will be important also to see how the various stakeholders will respond. So thank you.
Very much. And of course, in all of this, it's all about return on investment, what those regulations give in terms of incentives, helping organizations to actually decide to invest in this. We've got some questions coming in on incentives. Let's just sort of set the scene. Perhaps Ulf, back to you first about the investment. When a company is deciding where to invest, perhaps even competitive within a company, is it an orphan medicine or is it something that's going to have a huger impact in terms of the money back? What are the drivers for where to invest?
Adam has already laid out, I think, in some of his slides, the key conditions. I mean, of course, it depends from company to company. You have to look at it, you know, if you're a small biotech or if you're a large multinational corporation, but the principles are generally the same. First of all, of course, you need to have an interesting scientific lead, and the technology that is considered matching your portfolio, matching your capabilities, the investments you need, you know, where is your company operating, what type of manufacturing capabilities you have, etc. So the unmet need is always an important one, because if you do this wrong and the assessment wrong, and if the data that can be created is not matching, for instance, the assessment and payer requirements, so that would be a bad investment. So it starts always the science, I would think. And of course, that sometimes can be done on purpose, and sometimes it comes to you by chance, right? And then, of course, life cycle considerations, as I said, fit for portfolio, and then as any other industries, of course, and Adam explained it in a really nice way. You know, we have to fund research, we have to fund many failures, and we, of course, have to meet the shareholders and other financial expectations and obligations. So I think it's a triangulation of the three things of unmet need, science, return on investment, and the fit and the capability to bring something successfully to the market and long-term be committed to patients and the community.
Thank you. And then one of those key factors then on incentives, we've had a question coming in from David Schwicker saying it would be interesting to understand the breakdown of the 240 million average R&D costs. Is this including the cost of failures only on direct preclinical costs? Actually, could I bring Adam back in on this? He's in the background to take some of these. So looking at some of these figures about how the incentives play into it. Adam, do you want to pick that one up? He's saying, is this figure including the cost of failures?
I was just actually typing a long response in the chat to David, but the short answer is that no, that 240 million doesn't account for cost of failures. It doesn't account for cost of capital. It's one of the reasons why a number like that is very different from, say, the $2.6 billion figure that you sometimes hear that was quoted from Tufts in the US. Those numbers include the risk of failure. They include the cost of capital, which, as we saw, if your risk is 1 in 10, then it really changes things. The other thing just to say about the number we used, it was only the cost associated with the clinical trials. It doesn't account for any overheads the company has in doing R&D, which of course do exist. So as I said at the beginning, it's a very sort of conservative figure to have used.
Thank you. And looking at incentives and what they do in Europe, Simone, do you feel it's important that incentives are offered in Europe so that they're not just for, say, other markets, maybe in United States of America or Japan? Do you see it as a European as important here?
As a European myself, definitely, I think it's very important to maintain a balanced incentive framework that will allow both for, well, not both, but for three things. One, and first and foremost, from my perspective, patient access to adequate treatments, whether these are entirely innovative, completely breakthrough, or medicine that help managing a disease. That's very important. In particular, I would say that as a European, I would want each of our community, that people living with a rare disease, that are able to access the medicine they need to manage their condition, irrespective of where they live. Secondly, with the science that is coming in, and I see a lot of companies and also academic research coming out of Europe, we need to create Europe as a bedrock, or one of the bedrocks for innovative therapies development throughout the world. And at the moment, we do depend quite a bit from the US for a number of orphan drugs, but at the same time, there are a number of orphan drugs that are manufactured here in Europe, are discovered here in Europe, and I would want to see European small biotech or even startups so wanting to become the next big thing in Europe, and they need an environment that's suited for that. But there's not only financial incentives or regulatory incentives, but it's also about how they get from regulation to market. Effectively, here I bring a point, we don't have a European market. We have 27, if not more, different European markets. That is creating some of the disconnection that we see, particularly coming through also through the Q&A in terms of accessibility of therapies for the patient and the huge differences there are between countries in Europe. The third thing, we'll come back because I forgot it, sorry.
Thank you. Well, let's go to one of those questions. There's some great questions and comments coming in. Bernard Mallet says, what's the route to engage politicians who are mostly non-experts in the debate on orphan medicines development and reimbursement? They're likely to see high prices and small patient populations, not a politically attractive combination. And you touched there, Simone, on the national picture, the way that actually, of course, Europe is broken down into different national regulations for each particular healthcare authority. Today, what about engaging politicians? How can we get this on board?
Yeah, thank you, Sue, and also thank you for this question. I mean, yeah, let's not underestimate our politicians and our political leadership throughout Europe. I mean, no, I mean, just to as I already mentioned this, I mean, the topic of access to available, innovative and affordable medicine has been on the political agenda I think in most of the member states, but also here in Brussels in health council formation. So I think there, I mean, you see, and I mean, and this also crystallized, I think, quite clearly in the mandate of the current European Commission in the area of pharmaceuticals. I mean, I think you see this nice kind of balancing act. On the one hand, the mandate of the Commission says it says that Europe should be an innovative hub for pharmaceutical industry and for pharmaceutical innovation. And secondly, we also need to make sure as European Commission, but also as I think politicians, to make sure that our and I would like to echo what Simone said there. I mean, secondly, that we need to make sure that our European patients, that there is a supply of innovative and affordable medicines that actually reach our European patients. So I think this two-step approach, or I think the two steps are next to each other. innovative hub on the one hand, but also to make sure that our patients get these products for an affordable price. So yeah, I wouldn't underestimate there the political discussion. I think all the elements are there, and yeah, this is also the mandate that we are working. That is our mandate within the European Commission. So thank you.
Thank you. And it's interesting to think about the impact on the European ecosystem. A question's come in from Sarantis Makalopoulos from Euroactive Journalist. Thank you very much for showing us where you're from. That's very helpful. Asking, does the European Commission see any risk of losing pharma investments in orphan drugs if incentives change? And if yes, is there a plan B? Back to you, Tiddy.
I think, I mean, that to approach this question, I think it's important to flag, and I think most of the participants, they may be aware of this, that we conducted a study as European Commission in 2017, 2018 about the impact of the pharmaceutical incentives on innovation, availability, and accessibility. And I mean, I think so it was a Copenhagen economics report, so a consultancy in Denmark that did this study for the European Commission, and I think it clearly showed that the incentive framework in Europe is still very competitive vis-a-vis other jurisdictions. So and this goes for the orphan incentives, but also the general incentives, supplementary protection certificates, all kinds of for example RTD European research programs that we have. It also it also flagged, however, that of course also there is we have the European incentives, so the overall incentives, but there is also a lot of national incentives, and I think there you see sometimes a little bit of a disparity also in access. I mean, you have national taxation rules. You have, of course, the labor force. There is national policies in the field of orphans. So and this is also something that we try to flag in our evaluation. So, but I would say that we should be positive about the general incentives framework there. However, as I already mentioned, we also have some challenges to address. So, yeah, the overall picture I think is positive there. Thank you.
Thank you. And taking perhaps a wider view, we've had a question points coming in. Oncologist Paul Connors, he says, what does the USA do with its impact on Europe? He's saying that it has a big impact on what's going on here. He says that there's been a shift there with respect to patient cost sharing. Almost all orphan drugs in the US have shifted from co-payments to co-insurance, designed to control prescription utilization. He says, given the level of prices of many orphan drugs, it represents a significant shift of the cost burden onto the patient. And he's asking how that might affect orphan drug development. Simone, do you see that as a problem?
I don't know. I'm not an economist, and I think I refer to Adam. I point that what I would like to point out is that even without treatment, people with rare diseases, i.e., the patient and the families, carers and caregivers, already suffer huge financial difficulties, particularly when even more so when there is no treatment authorized. If you look at some of those neuromuscular disorders, which are very debilitating, the cost in modifying houses, modifying mode of transport, going through from multiple arrays of specialists to go for the treatment is very important, and in many cases it is on the shoulders of people living with rare disease, whether they're patients or families. Therefore, that's already a burden on the people with rare diseases. On top of that, I will also add that from an economic point of view, one of the key problems in rare diseases is diagnosis time, and that's still, with few exceptions, is still is a problem. As much as we committing to, or we are calling for, every person that enters in contact with the healthcare system with a rare disease is diagnosed within a year, which for common condition, that's unheard of. But that's for us what the scale is. The cost of non-diagnosis appropriately and the right time is massive for healthcare system and for the patient in terms of overuse of tests or multiple visits to different specialists to find the right diagnosis, and not to mention the economic losses for the patient themselves. So here we already have something that I would give it to Adam if he wishes to look more for the shift in the co-payments to co-insurance.
Thank you. And there is the question, of course, of defining what rare diseases actually are, and whether with subsets of some conditions that really needs to be thought about. Again, we've had a question in from Michelle Cantanzaro saying, according to the Technopolis report, the current regulation has partially led to unnecessary multiplications of rare diseases out of common diseases with subsets. And the question is posed there to Tide, is the new regulation, if that's to be, expected to address this issue of subsets and the definition of rare diseases itself? Tide, I think you're muted. Button. Okay, we can't hear today at the moment because he's got his button.
Sorry, yeah, I'm back. Sorry.
That's
some issues with the Zoom.
So on that question then of subsets and whether you're going to be looking at that and redefining indeed what a rare disease is.
I mean, I think indeed the evaluation flagged the point. I think it flagged 2 points. It flagged that there is a risk of indeed of all these subsets, but also of indication stacking, which has also been a political point on the agenda lately in the EU. To what extent, so that you have like this multiplication of rare diseases out of common diseases, and to what extent it impacts the sustainability of the orphan regulation. So this was flagged in the report and also in our evaluation. So yes, we are looking at this. So to be continued, but it was indeed flagged. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Let's take some more questions coming in. We've got one that we'd like to put. It's quite a wide question on seeing how far in the future. Let's just come back to this one here. This is from Richard Stakelum. I'd like to hear the panel's take on how they see the potential that gene therapies may bring to rare diseases, and how health budgets will manage these therapies. Ulf.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some recent examples, of course, in that space. Science is progressing fast. We are talking mostly curative diseases, or at least treatments with a very high effectiveness. Of course, there's the question of budget. Then at the same time, this is a one-time impact on very sort of impactful diseases, and if you get to this level of clinical effectiveness, the cost effectiveness is definitely given. I think what of course is needed is potentially, and I think we've seen this after long debate. Novartis is the most prominent example. If everyone will probably have read in the press with Zolgensma, right? And the ability, I think, to move away from the price per treatment or price per pill type of concept in gene therapy is obviously not a pill, is the ability, I think, to solve the economic case on those. In other words, different payment models, payments over time. The sky is the limit, and what you could imagine, I think that, of course, requires flexibility on the authorities and the sick fund / payers in different countries depending on the system. But it's a wonderful progress, I think, and again, it is a budget impact that is very predictable, because it's usually only one time. It's just a matter of finding the payment modalities that meet these treatments, and I think they will and have to be adjusted over time.
Thank you. And picking up on that, a point from Michelle Conway, she talks about the transparency of pricing and why that is so important. She asks, how do you see companies and payers coming together on a compromise that suits the needs of all parties going forward to ensure that the pricing isn't a major sticking problem for patients gaining access to valuable medicines in the future? Today, do you want to pick that up first? Transparency of pricing.
Yeah, I mean, I can of course shortly say something about this. I mean, but yeah, as we all know, I mean, pricing is not in the competence of the EU. It's a national competence, and I think what we have been seeing recently is that there is more European cooperation between like-minded countries to work on joint HTA, joint horizon scanning, but also possibly joint negotiations. So there is this development, but it's a little bit out of the scope of the European Commission. Although of course we also participate in these kind of preparations, but.
Thank you. Let's pass that one to Ulf. What about transparency on pricing? Because it's always such a sticking point. It's always coming up. Patients want to know, can they get the drugs at the prices they want? What about transparency?
Yeah, look, I mean, I would relate back to my opening comment of the high-level forum that FPI has suggested a broader engagement between all the stakeholders involved, and of course, the orphan area needs different models of assessment and different models of pricing. If we take the UK for an example, obviously prices should reflect value. Now, value is of course a relative concept. The value of an orphan drug that we just discussed in a gene therapy that is essentially a cure is a different one than a new blood pressure medicine. So some of the thresholds that are developed that define the cost effectiveness and indirectly the value, of course, of your pricing don't fit the world of orphan drugs. So I think we need to see the pricing and the payments of those type of drugs over the life cycle. And I think that will help address the challenges that you mentioned, and also in terms of transparency.
But let's pick up that point you make about the suggestion that comes through the EU Health Coalition that there should be a high-level forum on access to health innovation and bring together all the relevant stakeholders. What then might that achieve? Simone, what would you like to see come out of something like that?
Understanding what really is meant for innovation and what does it mean. I think here one of the key areas where such a forum could be of help would be in building trust and understanding between the different parties of what is needed. If I take the example on gene therapies and what does it mean for rare diseases, which was a question that was asked before, that is a topic that does require a European level forum, because one, the gene therapies that are coming through are revolutionary. Certainly, we can say that they are transformative. We cannot yet say that they are curative because the data on which they are based are short, but we can see that if we take the example of SMA, of what that therapy does to children that otherwise would have seen a certain death before the age of 2, that is remarkable. But the numbers that we have are very small on individual countries, even the greatest in the most populated countries. This said, that's why we need to understand how these therapies will be priced and what's the process, the thinking process behind both the companies and the payers, and looking at what they see the value. And I think of the value of this therapy for the society. And I think having a European discussion around this with proper implementation in individual countries is of great importance. And if you allow me to introduce what potentially a post-COVID environment could look like, we see already a lot of things that we have been advocating for coming through with the crisis that we have, particularly around joint procurable therapies, particularly around EU support for cross-border healthcare. This is feasible. This would work a great deal for rare disease patients.
Thank you. And picking up on that point there, Ansgar Hebben has said that more equal access across the EU comes up all the time, and a lot more is required to focus on potential solutions beyond the EU instruments like OMP regulation, perhaps building on that. It needs more of the debate, and this needs to be continued. So perhaps looking at not only legislative, which is already there, but non-legislative solutions. Who'd like to pick that up? Today, is there room for building alongside the regulation to build in non-legislative solutions to some of the issues of pricing, access, availability, and so on?
Yeah, thank you, Sue. I think indeed, I mean, our evaluation clearly flagged that you have external factors influencing very much this access debate. I mean, it is about national pricing and reimbursement requirements. It's also about launching decisions by companies. I mean, what we see is that companies, they launch first in a number of member states, and then in a staggered way, it goes to other member states. You see, of course, you see differences in prescription habits. So there is all kinds of external factors influencing this. At the same time, yeah, you could also have a look at possible internal factors that may influence access. So, I mean, we're looking at this, both at these internal and external factors. Non-legislative, I think it's more, we're mostly focusing on the legislation there. So, thank you.
And thank you, Ulf. What about your further thoughts on that? You mentioned before about the ecosystem, about other organizations that have been spawned that support the development of orphan medicines and indeed stimulating innovation. What non-legislative options might there be that you'd like to see come up and discussed at a high-level forum?
Look, I mean, the root causes, of course, on delays and access matters they're multifactorial. It is matters of international reference pricing. We just talked about the staggered launch. This, of course, is due to duplication sometimes of evidence requirement, first at EMA level, then at national level. Then you have it in countries like Spain and Italy, and on regional level. You have very different methodologies in terms of assessment and pricing of orphan drugs. And I think the sum of these factors is, I think, where we support this high-level forum that I like to repeat in order to understand and co-create novel, flexible, collaborative models. We need to, I think, be more flexible, and at the national level, put access and speed to access as the main priority. You know, in countries like Germany, where you have the first year a sort of immediate reimbursement after EMA approval, for instance, and then you sort of assess and negotiate your pricing and reimbursement model. I think that needs to be changed in many member states. Patients have to come first, and the access and speed to access has to be prioritized over lengthy and duplicative processes. And I think aligning all stakeholders would allow to develop probably models that address this type of need in a much better way, and then, of course, think about reforms on the way orphan drugs are being paid and reimbursed for.
Thank you. And picking up on that point, Jakob Rasch says that we see an increase in regulatory approved orphan drugs. However, reports show that patients receiving innovations is extremely low. How can we improve access in EU to orphan drugs? The big question. Simone, how would you like to see that access improved?
Well, I would like to see improved in an even way, because what the question asked was that we don't see the patient receiving the innovation that is coming through. Well, the short answer is it depends where you live. If you live in Germany, you are more likely to get it. If you live in Slovakia, or if you live in Eastern European countries, both industry and our own research show that there are greater delays as compared to to Western European countries, and even in the most advanced countries, with the exception of Germany, there is a lower availability of therapies compared to the list approved by the European Commission and the European Medicine Agency. That's why we still call for a better integration and cooperation at European level to improve the access for everyone, because that can be done. We're looking at relatively small numbers. We can see what's going on, and also we can rely upon an ever-growing and a new and growing healthcare infrastructure that is the European reference network, which now are looking at improving diagnosis, improving knowledge, but in the future they do represent the backbone for clinical care of people with rare disease.
Thank you. Well, we're coming towards the end of our time for this session, and you've all raised some amazing points. Thank you for all the questions coming in. It's been very, very interesting to hear about the Dolan report, giving new light on the value of the orphan medicines regulation, what that has done to help orphan medicines coming through. We've heard from industry saying that this regulation has delivered, it works, it should be maintained. The European Commission is now assessing and making its valuations on all of this information, looking ahead to the impact study coming up. And of course, everybody wants to keep innovation alive in Europe, not see it go elsewhere, wants to inspire more companies to get involved, to invest and develop in this area. And it seems from the discussions that innovation can't be taken for granted. To close the session, I'd like to pose a question to each of our panelists to ask you about orphan medicines are often then at the cutting edge of science. So how can the pharmaceutical and industrial strategies, as well as any other policy levers, put Europe at the forefront of medicine innovation? Ulf, would you like to close your thoughts here on this one first?
Yes, I mean, you just mentioned it. I mean, from our perspective, and you've heard my comments, we do believe that the OMP regulation has delivered and will continue to deliver in the framework. From our perspective, you know, we would suggest to work on collaborative solution to address the other outstanding issues, which is access and availability. And ultimately, as I also outlined, is what we want more innovation in Europe and not less. You know, we see in China and in other clusters, companies or coming biotech is uprising. So I think it is also a matter of, and especially in these COVID times, it is a matter of maintaining the competitiveness and the incentive of great and wonderful biotech clusters we have already in Europe. And I think, you know, they continue to flourish with the right framework and incentive assessment.
So Tide, what was your take on that? How can Europe still stay ahead in innovation in this field?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Sue. I mean, this is, and I already mentioned this. I mean, this is clearly, I mean, one of the aspects that is in the current mandate of the Commission. I mean, so that Europe remains a hub for innovation. At the same time, we also need this supply of innovative and affordable medicines for European patients. So I think this is the clear instructions also for the forthcoming pharmaceutical strategy that will be due later this year, possibly next month. And at the same time, as part of this pharmaceutical strategy, we will also be further discussing the future of the orphan regulation, and we will be publishing this inception impact assessment for further feedback. So I would like to flag these two documents that will be published later this year. And it should address both the questions around innovation, but also around patient access to the products, to the medicinal products. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's leave the last word to the patients. Simone.
Thank you, Sue. What an honor. Perhaps it's also difficult to bring to an end such insightful discussions. But what I think is important to note for everyone that if we do have a Europe that is competitive in innovation, it is beneficial for the patient themselves. And here, what should the clear outcome of a pharmaceutical strategy for Europe be is that it creates a European-wide ecosystems that brings all of the relevant parties together, and it creates a balanced incentive environment to bring to the fore medicines that do provide good outcomes, and they are responding to patient needs. And I trust we are on the good way. 20 years of orphan medicinal products have shown improvements. Job's not done, but we can do it.
Job's not done. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all the panel. Thank you to Adam from Dolan for his report. Thank you to everybody who's been watching and for all the questions that have come in. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but it's been very, very helpful. Some of them can be answered online. Thank you all for joining this very important debate. It's been wonderful being with you. Thank you very much indeed. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Watch on YouTube when it's up there later. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.